Well, good evening, dear listeners, and my co-host, Glenn Lingerveld. And as you can see, two very distinguished gentlemen joining us. One represents the future of Kyalami, I could put it that way, Dr. Greg Mills. The other, the foundation of this establishment. Unfortunately, his partner in crime, if I can put it that, tongue-in-cheek, Adrian Pheiffer cannot join us tonight, and we wish him all the best with his health. But I think between these two gentlemen, we can cover most of what Kalani represents. And well, let's start off with the modern side of it. Dr. Mills, you've been given the, well, a second title tonight, that of being Mr. Adrian Pheiffer. And that's quite a tall order. The man behind me on that picture, he did wonders for Kalani in his day. It started off a bit difficult with Kalani, 2 Grand Prix that didn't work out the way they planned, and they had to make some serious plans to recover what was lost with the 2 Grand Prix at Kalani. Would you mind starting us off on covering what happened with the 2 Grand Prix? Why weren't they a success in the era?
Well, of course, Kalani's, and good evening to everybody, and it's a great honor and pleasure always to be on the Motor Show, and particularly with someone that I've always looked up to in Mr. Joubert, which he keeps on insisting I call him Denis, but it's very hard to forget the habits of a lifetime. I've known him since I can remember, literally. And he was always the master in charge of Kyalami, so it's very hard to consider him otherwise. Kyalami's history goes back nearly 75 years now. It doesn't just go back to those Cape Grand Prix. It goes back to 1947 when the bypass was used to build a strip of road where people decided to race their cars. And that, of course, evolved into the first iteration of the Kyalami track in, I think, 1952, and then the second iteration in 55. And you can see some of that original track past the clubhouse still today, the road that runs past it. And then, of course, the later edition, which was laid out by Edgar Hall and his best man, two surveyors, who was my father, and Edgar Hall, of course, was the designer of the circuit, but involving, of course, as in everything at Kyalami, huge numbers of volunteers who built the track that we know as Kyalami today. So it's really the fourth iteration of the Kyalami circuit. And of course, you could say that with the karting track being built in the 60s and then changed twice since then, in the 70s and then in the 1980s, that in fact there have been multiple more iterations, but Kyalami main circuit, as we know it today, came about in time for the 2 Grand Prix of 1960 and 1962. And Mr. Joubert will know the story better than me because I was only born in 1962. But essentially the club, as it was known then, which wasn't the WPMC. The WPMC came about as a consequence of this. The promoters of the event and the builders of the track incurred a massive debt. If I remember, it was £20,000 back then, which they borrowed from the divisional council to refurbish the track. And this, because of the financial cost of the 2 Grand Prix, which were financial disasters for Kyalami, the club, and I forget whether it was the amateur automobile club, Dennis, or whether it was the Mets. You'll know that better than me, who were actually directly responsible for running those 2 events. I know there was a special promotional committee, the Tex Kingdom Proprietary Committee, if I remember, which was set up at the time. But they incurred a dramatic loss. And essentially, the lease, as a consequence of that, where the terms of the lease were changed, in which Kyalami had a right to buy the land for a minimal sum of money, and to save Kyalami and to save the management thereof, the WPMC came about. But it only came about after Adrian Pheiffer had the incredibly good idea for the time of running a motor show, and I think that was in 1965. Again, you'll correct me, Denis, but which essentially was run at the Goodwood Showgrounds and covered the losses that were made by Kyalami. So all that money, that debt that was incurred, was paid back as a consequence of a single person's big idea. Of course, this was a club involving many people giving tremendously, building the track, building the earlier versions of the track. But it was Adrian Pheiffer who really birthed modern Kyalami and the WPMC, which was then formed out of an amalgam of all the independent clubs. The Amateur Automobile Racing Club, the Cape Car Club, there was a rally section as well, the Mets, they all absorbed into the WPMC, which has been running Kyalami ever since. So it's a story really of making a plan. Kyalami is a story of making a plan. It's a story of members' sweat and efforts and toil without really a cent of public money, because the public money was paid back, to build a facility which is a world-class motor racing facility, which was then, of course, in a very rural setting. It seemed like a million miles away from Cape Town. No one would ever have imagined that Cape Town would eventually one day overtake it and head up, the West Coast as it does today. But it was really a club built by its members, members of different clubs, and then members of one club in the WPMC from 1965 onwards. And of course, between Adrian and Denis, they're really responsible, along with other people, Ronnie Hare, Ronnie Scullard, amongst others, Cecil Barata, for steering the club through that period, out of the 60s, into the 70s, and into what we understand to be Kyalami of today, increasingly developing the facilities with private money, with private sweat and initiative and industriousness, continuously putting back money into the circuit, developing the circuit continuously. And of course, finally, to conclude this is the case that we make to the city of Cape Town today, as we sit on the cusp of a lease extension to be able to continue the next era of Kyalami motor racing circuit, where we would like to see it become more commercial, more inclusive, and that's not just in racial terms, but in terms of broader communities of motorsport enthusiasts, including spinners. I know that that's been a recent controversy, but including all aspects of motorsport and taking motorsport off the streets and onto the track where it belongs, and playing a pivotal role in road safety at the time. So it was the hard work of 75 years that got us to where we are today, interspersed with these key developments, 47, 52, 55, 59, the two Grand Prix, the creation of WPMC in 65, and then into the Springbok Series races of the 1960s and 1970s, which Denis managed under his stewardship, through the 80s, through the build-up of different sections of the club to what we understand to be Kyalami. So we owe Adrian and Denis really an enormous, inestimable debt of appreciation for what they've done for motorsport in the Western Cape.
Very well said, bravo. I feel like clapping hands now. Those two gents.
He said he's going to send me a food hamper at the end of this program, so I'm waiting for it.
Well, you call him Mr. Joubert. I'm Afrikaans born, so I'm going to stick to my traditional way of speaking to elderly gentlemen, and this is Denis. But please, we would like to hear your version of Kyalami, and please take us back to the era, because I consider Adrian, yourself, as the foundation of Kyalami. But as the doctor just said now, we were only born when you guys were already running the show. So I would like to hear it from your mouth. Take us through the your era of Kyalami.
What shall I tell you? Greg Mills was quite correct in what he said. Kyalami actually started to grow strongly when the clubs amalgamated to form the Western Province Motor Club. But before that, we had difficult times. The site was originally given to the Metropolitan Motorcycle and by the Divisional Council of the Cape. But as Dr. Mills said, we ran into a lot of trouble with the first and second Grand Prix, which were run at a loss by a committee which was consisted of members from all the racing clubs in Cape Town at that time. And like a lot of committees of that type, it didn't go well. And the Grand Prix were run at a loss. And that was the biggest problem. We lost control of Kyalami. And we didn't actually ever get it back again, because since then we've been on leasehold property. And at the end of the 50s, we actually owned the place. But that's the way it is. And at the moment, we are in the throes of negotiating a new lease with the city of Cape Town. And our current the people who are in charge of Kyalami at the moment are doing a very good job, I think. And Dr. Mills is at the head of this discussion with the city of Cape Town. And it seems to be going in the right direction at the moment. Do you agree, Greg?
Yeah, I don't want to doom it by predicting its outcome, Denis. But no, I think there's a broad recognition that Kyalami adds tremendous value annually to the people of Cape Town, as well as to the local economy. It has more than 100 garages there, half a dozen medium-sized businesses running out of Kyalami. Excuse me. It has a whole bunch of opportunities ahead of it in terms of internationalizing motorsport. And I think it's a tremendous asset to the city of Cape Town. And I've mentioned already road safety, getting racing off the streets, training and all sorts of things. But there's more that can be done. We don't have to sit back on our laurels. We always have to continue to develop the facility, look for anchor tenants, look to integrate Kyalami with the motor industry. When Formula E hopefully comes to South Africa next year, we will have some engagement. There'll be some Formula E laps at Kyalami. We'll be lending marshals to the Formula E race in the city of Cape Town. So we see it as a a synergy with the people and the city. We don't see it as a motor club apart from the interests of the people of Cape Town. And I think that is broadly understood by the management of both the province and of the city of Cape Town. And many of them have been to Kyalami now in the last year and have seen for themselves what it has to offer, which is, I think in motorsport terms, quite remarkable that a club has developed a facility at no public expense. And that, as I said, is a testament to leadership. But I think Denis and Adrian also have to be singled out also for their own motorsport achievements.
Excellent.
I mean, we like to see them as simply as managers of our fortune. But they were much more than that. They were fantastic drivers in their own right. Denis's career went on a little longer than Adrian's. So I didn't actually ever recall seeing Adrian Pheiffer drive. But from all accounts, he was an extremely competitive driver in the 1960s, both in single-seaters and latterly in sports cars in his own APM or APM, I think it was called,
APM, yeah.
which was a Lotus 23 look-alike. And Denis, of course, starting and progressing through into darts, and then most famously, if he minds me saying so, in his two chevrons, the B8 and the B16 chevron in the 1970s, shared with the likes of Clary Taylor and Peter Goff, of course. There was a tremendous contribution that they made, and there's, I think, the B16 in the background, there's the APM, a tremendous contribution that he made and Adrian made to racing itself in the Western Cape. So these are two extremely talented gentlemen with very big hearts who have given hugely to a club which has been at the center of their lives. And I think you see that in Adrian's role in writing continuously about motorsport. And I always admired his multiple personalities that he had in placing articles in a whole bunch of newspapers continuously. I think one of them was to do with a relation or a maiden name of his wife or something. There were all sorts of tricks of the trade, which we can only but learn from. But the energy you have to put into doing that, week in and week out, keeping motorsport in the news, keeping it in people's minds is quite remarkable. While Denis was running, of course, the club. So it's a Tweedledee and Tweedledum association, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but two Siamese twins, or a pair of Siamese twins, who were running the club. And the remarkable thing about it is, unlike other motor racing circuits, which are, if you mind me saying so, always characterized by more than the odd charlatan and Johnny come lately kind of midnight cowboy type operator, Kyalami has had a very steady hand on the tiller for 75 years. I mean, quite remarkable, because motorsport is a fraught business to manage. It's egos, it's complex, it's money, it's ambition, it's people thinking they've been hard done by. There's always another excuse, but it never involves you. All of these things. It's a very peculiar sport like this. And yet, I think the management of the WPMC has been literally like a cruise liner. It's kept going throughout. So, frankly, and I say this as the person stepping into Denis's very large shoes as the president of the WPMC, if we can do but half as good a job as they've done, Kyalami will be in a tremendous place.
Agreed. May I change the subject a little bit and just make a reference to the car behind me, the B16. Denis, with all respect said, how could you ever have sold a beautiful car like that?
How could I what?
Have sold a beautiful car like that?
Those were different days. You bought and sold motor cars, just it was just a thing done. You raced a car for a while and then you sold it, and you bought something else, and you drove something else, or you moved into another category. And none of us realized how very valuable these things would become.
Absolutely.
If we had realized that, we would probably be a lot better off today than what we are. If we kept all these motor cars.
Given my statement now, that's obviously my favorite car of everything you raced in your era. Would you, if you have to pick a favorite car? I know you're a very keen. You still have GSM darts and flamingos. Is there a preference for you, or did you enjoy all of them?
That B16 was the nicest motor car I've ever driven.
They were indecently quick for the era.
It handled beautifully, and it went very well, and it did surprisingly good lap times for that period. You know, they were 69, 70. And
We won't say it too loud, but it wouldn't be far off the Janetta pace, would it, Dr. Mills?
It depends who's driving it. If it was me, it would probably be a lot slower. But as I looked and waved at the crowds. But I mean, I think Denis was doing 116s in the B16. And, you know, 116 today is something we could comfortably do in the Janetta. But you know, the tires, the advances in the tires and the advances in the track. I mean, absolutely. And the driver gizmos you have today, ABS and this and that, and anti-track, you know, anti-slip and traction control. I mean, you know, hot and cold running water and a cappuccino maker. I mean, it really is a different ball game. And that was a car that you really had to drive and wring its neck, I have no doubt. And, you know, if you think about Brian Redman, I think in 71 or 72, I think he did an 11.6 in the B19 or B21 Chevron, 19 Chevron. Just astonishing. I mean, you know, if you know, I think Jeroen Blekkemolen did a 12 or an 11.9 in the Janetta, and you know, that's a contemporary 24-hour Le Mans driver, and you know, right at the top of his game probably in endurance racing terms. So that puts the lap speeds of those times on wholly inferior tires on a narrower track, and it gives some idea of the quality of the drivers that we had both in South Africa, but also those who used to visit us, the likes of Brian Redman and others who were just, you know, these were world-class individuals. And I think the fact that we produced Jody Scheckter out of that era is testament to that. It's not a surprise that the competitiveness of South African motorsport and the ingenuity that went into developing local cars in the 1960s produced great driving talent.
It's a topic I discussed with Denis a little earlier tonight, and that is the South African innovation, the talent of the driver, engineer in the era. After the World War, not a great many cars in South Africa to race, yet they produced some of the most amazing single-seater race cars you can dream of. They compared very well with everything internationally. What would you consider that a golden era of the sport? Have we lost that, or is it just the modern era that have developed into all these guys disappearing into, well, you can't really say that. I'm sorry, I'm contradicting myself here. But because you can see the South African talent in Formula One with Rory Byrne and Gordon Murray. They're still around, but we don't see them as much on the local front anymore.
Is that for me or Denis?
Well, he seems to be thinking about it.
Well, I mean, I'll just throw my 10 cents in worth while he thinks about it, and he'll come up with a comment. But, you know, I don't see one era as better than another era. I think the difference was motorsport was more accessible at the top era in those days. So you could build, like Peter de Klerk, 1.5-liter Formula One car and actually compete in a Grand Prix. Or like Doug Saruria, one of his many LDSs, of which they're more in existence than were ever made now, of course, because they do have value. But you know, you could build your own car, copied and borrowed ideas from elsewhere, sure, but you could then compete internationally. And of course, motorsport today is different. You know, it's more like aviation. It's got incredibly complex systems. The average saloon car that you buy and drive to work is testament to that too. You know, these are very sophisticated, electronically driven devices. And I think the big change happened in the 80s when you went essentially from analog motor cars to digital motor cars, because it made them more sophisticated, more complex. and it made it impossible. And Rory Byrne himself said this to me when I was interviewing him for the Agriculture, Furniture and Marmalade book. He said, I think the last car that he drew up himself was in the late 1980s. I think it was in 1987. We actually drew the whole car. And after that time, you've got huge design teams, 100 people strong, working on producing a motor car. And then you've got, of course, huge engineering teams, wind tunnel teams, at least in F1, and so on and so forth. So the ability of the single individual, a Gordon Murray, a Rory Byrne, and others, to make that impact, Doug Saruria too, is limited, but they are out there and they do exist. And there have been a whole range of South Africans. One of them served in our own pit crew, is now a key member of the Mercedes Formula One team. They remain largely anonymous because these teams are so big, 500 people to a team and so on. And it's hard then to distinguish one particular individual. I mean, how many people do you know in the Mercedes team other than the drivers and Toto? Or the same could be said for Red Bull, other than Adrian Newey and Christian Horner and the two drivers. So, but there are hundreds of people, and there are many South Africans within their ranks. And I don't think we have any less driving talent. It's just that the route to F1, which we regard as the pinnacle of motorsport, which was more accessible with less money before, has become extremely expensive. And you have to make quite early on your choices about which direction you're going to take in motorsport. So in the old days, a driver like Brian Redmond would drive in sports cars one weekend, in Formula 5000 in America the next weekend, then he'd be racing in a Formula One event somewhere else. And Jody Scheckter did much the same in the early stages of his career. But gradually people have become much more specialized in driving. And this meant that while we have a number of extraordinary driving talents, the Van der Linde brothers, David Perel, among others, who have come from the Cape, and we're still continuing to churn those drivers out, they go into other areas of motorsport which don't have quite the same Sunday afternoon profile that F1 continues to have. So I don't think motor racing in South Africa is in a bad shape. It's just in different shape to what it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Well put. The reason why I touched on that subject, because this gentleman here also had to make up his mind as to what he wanted to do. And I made a discovery that I didn't know about his background recently, and that is that this man rallied as well, but not in a conventional rally car, in a Ford Cortina Big 6, 3-liter. Please fill us in on that gap, because I never knew that you were a rally driver as well as a racing driver.
No, I was just a pretend rally driver for a while.
But that must have been a handful. That is a serious motor car to take rallying.
You were referring to that B16. Incidentally, that car is in America now, in North America, and it's driven regularly in classic car events by Brian Redmond.
Still to this day.
Yeah, it's been rebuilt, I think, 3 times since I had it, and anyway, he races it regularly. So
Well, we had him staying in South Africa. We had him staying in South Africa for a while. It would have been great to still have him here, and maybe he would have brought your car back as well.
No, he doesn't own the car. Some American collector owns it, but he races it for this chap. And
the other element I have to touch on, you created one of the longest running series of motorsport in South Africa with Group 1 Racing. Now, if you listen to Sarel van der Merwe and everybody talking today, they still want to see that back again. But in your era, it worked fantastic. It became a very popular series. You had some brilliant drivers in there, and some of the dirtiest drivers I've ever seen as well. But Group N became the talk of the town. It became a very successful series. Your thoughts at the time? Why did you move in that direction? Where did that brilliant idea come from?
I just saw the success of Group N racing in England, and we were a bit in the doldrums here with a lack of a decent formula at that time. It was 1984. So we decided I decided as chairman of the Western Province Motor Club to get Group N racing underway here. And so I approached Volkswagen in particular, and with whom I was the directorate of Volkswagen. I was very friendly with them, and they agreed to support the idea. And so we staged the first Group N 3-hour race at Kyalami in Cape Town in 1984. And the event was won by Sarel van der Merwe and Jochen Maas. And then from then on, Group N racing took off, and I was also chairman of the National Car Racing Committee at the time, so I had quite a lot of clout, and I managed the following year to make it a national championship. And I think it lasted for about 10 years or so.
85 to 95, yes.
Yeah.
Well,
And it was a very successful event because we had large fields of cars. I mean, we'd have 35, 40 motor cars running in an event, which was very good.
Dr. Mills, I'm going to make a statement now, and you can possibly knock my teeth out again about it. But I feel that something that's very wrong with modern day motorsport is that we've lost some of the characters of the sport. In other words, it's become very commercialized in the sense that it's all about the manufacturer, not about the guy behind the wheel anymore. In my younger days, used to go to Kyalami and Killarney supporting either Abel de Oliveira or a Tony Viana or a Nico Bianco or Ben Morgenroth or Willie Hebburn. Rather than saying that you're going there supporting a Ford or and I don't mean it negative, or a manufacturer of a specific car. Although those drivers individually became the face of a specific manufacturer. You can't talk about Tony Viana without talking about BMW. You can't talk about Abel de Oliveira without talking about Alfa Romeo, or Ben Morgenroth and Mazda, and Willie Hebburn and Opel. They can all be associated to a specific manufacturer. But in today's racing, and I say this with all due respect, you don't know the faces behind the wheel anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's generally a problem for motorsport, and maybe for many sports, and it's partly the changes in motorsport per se, but it's also changes in media because I think people have so much to choose from on the television screens. They don't follow the sports perhaps quite in the manner that they used to. But I would agree with you in as much as heroes and villains are a part of any sporting environment. And you want to have your Bucky's Buerta, your enforcer, which other sides love to hate, but you love him because he's on your side. And you need a somebody on the other side who you love to hate, normally because they're very good players. And you say all sorts of disparaging things about them as a consequence, and that just provides a needle, And Sorrel was often at the middle of those. And I don't think you'd mind me saying this. Was much of that needle in South African motorsport. His character lent itself to that, whether it was rally rivalries with Jan Hettemer. You only have to read Sorrel's biography to learn of some of the extremely amusing, if rather profane events that happened. And that went into circuit racing, the famous needle with Ian Schechter and the crash at Kyalami and in the Manufacturers Challenge Series. These were the stuff of which competition was made. But I think today, it's probably not that it's about the car so much, is that maybe we don't build up the driver needle. That the media, and you guys are in the media, don't start creating that friction. We become too nice and too media friendly, and we manage this in a far too sort of urbane manner. You are seeing some of that in F1. I think the Verstappen-Hamilton rivalry is starting to emulate perhaps the Prost-Senna rivalry, or the Mansell-Senna rivalry as it was in the 1980s. It is very good for the sport. And it does create who's going to win this week. Is it going to be my driver or their driver? Whoever that driver might be. And then, of course, having a few sort of surprise victories, an AlphaTauri or a Renault wins a Grand Prix, that throws in a new dimension into it, or McLaren 2 weeks ago. So we need a bit more of that, and I think we need media coverage as part and parcel of that answer. But we're not alone. I mean, NASCAR's numbers are massively down from the heydays of the 90s and early 2000s, when they used to draw 250,000 spectators at an event. They're taking out seats in the oval tracks to make them look fuller, because the generation that followed NASCAR is largely dying out. They used to go from race to race in their motorhomes, and a lot of that's been replaced by television and the endless multi-channel fares that we have on offer, and you can watch motorsport from the comfort of your sofa, and if it doesn't go to your liking, you click the channel and you go on to the next sport. It's changed its nature, but I don't think it's useful to bemoan that. It's just a reality. It's like electronics in motor cars. It's hard to manage or bemoan that or try and isolate that. You just have to reintroduce some flavor into motorsport. And I'm very pleased that again this December we're going to be hosting an international 9-hour event at Kyalami on the 11th of December, and we're going to have as supporting events a whole range of historic races. And we've actually dropped the entry fee for upcountry cars to zero, and made a fixed entry fee well below the normal level for all local cars. And we're running a unique set of regulations, which is basically we're going to decide whether it's a historic car or not. We're giving it an age category limitation, because the aim is to increase the fields, to increase public following, to bring people back to Kyalami, to create that atmosphere that we had in days gone by, to make it a family event, because there's a danger of it being estranged from the general public, and to bring some international stars that people still like to see and to hear of. That we have international figures who may have been F1 drivers in some instances, may have been superstars in the 1980s and 90s, maybe even the 2000s. So that's our aim. And I think Kyalami has, and South Africa generally has, the incredible advantage in terms of, and this is something that Denis and his team took advantage of in the Springbok series, of weather. And we can use that to attract Northern Hemisphere people down, maybe for a race, but also to stay for a while, bring their families. And it's very exciting that we're waiting for the confirmation, but they've agreed that their names can be used, that we're likely to get Emanuele Pirro, who's a 5-time winner of Le Mans, coming on the 11th of December, as well as a factory driver lineup of Ginettas. So, there's much to look forward to. I am a glass half full person, but we have to change with the times. I don't think it helps to sit there and moan and groan about it and say that not that I'm saying you're doing that, I'm just saying we have to move with that and adapt to those new realities. And I'm excited that the club is responding in this way.
And is the Rallycross coming back also? Talking about international events.
Sorry, say again?
The Rallycross event, is that also coming back to Kyalami?
Or I'm afraid I can't hear. Maybe your microphone, bring it a little closer or something.
If I can, but what he was asking is the Rallycross. It's not coming back this year, but from what I understood, it's coming back next year, or as soon as the pandemic takes a hike.
Well, of course. I mean, I just joined this meeting from a ManCom meeting of the WPMC, which, of course, one of the advantages of living in Johannesburg and braving the storm outside is that with Zoom, you can be a member of a committee and still participate. But obviously, everything is subject to COVID. Is there going to be a fourth wave, a fifth wave, a sixth wave? I believe there were 7 waves in the Spanish flu at the end of the First World War. Fingers crossed we won't have 7 waves, and fingers crossed that when we get that critical mass of people vaccinated, that we'll be able to welcome spectators back to the sport, and we wait to hear what the president has to say in this regard. But if we are able to manage the virus, excuse me, if we're able to manage the virus and we see a flattening of the curve over time, hopefully we will have the WRX and, of course, also the Formula E race playing its small part at Kyalami as well. And then in the end of 20, so that the WRX race would be in November. And then again in December 2022, we would have another 9-hour and try and build this up into more of a spectacle, and perhaps we can get more and more overseas participation at the same time. So I think there's a lot to aim for, a lot to look forward to.
Could I throw a rock into this as well? The 9 hours is a brilliant concept. I personally consider the Springbok series to be the absolute highlight of motorsport. Is there any prospect of that becoming a type of a Springbok series again? This is a wild question at this stage, I know. But there's so much development of circuits like Luanda and Mozambique. It'll be great to see them form part of something like this again, back into what was Rhodesia. Motorsport everywhere seems to be picking up again, and that's very encouraging.
Yes, I mean, I think it's quite hard. There's a South African endurance racing series, which has been very successful over the past 4 or 5 years. And that, of course, has a series across South African tracks. But what we would like to see develop is some synergy between Kyalami and East London, because the huge advantage of the East London track, like Kyalami, is that it remains unaltered since it held, in its case, World Championship Grand Prix in the 1960s. And it was in 1962, famously, that it held its first Grand Prix, its first World Championship Grand Prix, which was the needle between BRM and Lotus, which was won in BRM's only World Championship victory by Graham Hill when Jimmy Clark dropped out. So, if we could have on consecutive weekends an endurance race at Kyalami, an endurance race at East London with a supporting cast of historic cars, that's something to aim for. I think there's always a danger that you overshoot and deliver far less, but I think that as we gradually build up the 9-hour at Kyalami, it lends itself to a following weekend where people would be willing to stay and take their cars onto East London or vice versa, to be able to have 2 race meetings on 2 tracks. And this is the remarkable bit, that hosted Grand Prix and remain unaltered over more than 60 years, which is an incredible asset. I mean, particularly in the historic racing community, people really, savor things like that. And I think there's, again, a tremendous asset which remains relatively unexploited in a South African context.
Dennis,
Ja,
ons kan net sê vir jou baie dankie vir al die jare wat jy ingesit het vir Kyalami. Ek gaan nou Afrikaans praat want dit is gemakliker. Wat sien jy as die hoogtepunt van jou era by Kyalami? Was dit
dis 'n moeilike vraag.
there must be something that stands out head and shoulders above the rest. You've done so much. You've been involved with everything. But there must be something that was particularly pleasing for you over all these years.
I think our decision to make Kyalami into more than a race circuit by building garages and workshops and so on. We were the first circuit to do this. And we've now been copied by the other circuits, as you know, over the years. And that has in turn made the circuits more viable. And it was certainly the reason why Kyalami stayed viable, because you actually can't make very much money out of motor racing per se. Motor races as such. They're too expensive. They're too expensive to promote. And so you have to have other sponsorships or other ways of making money. And what we did at Kyalami was to create a stable income from the buildings that we have on site. As Dr. Mills mentioned just now, we have more than 100 garages and I think something like about 12 workshops, and they generate enough money to keep the circuit going basically without motorsport.
Well, the reason why I touched on that subject is when, as a youngster, I don't come from a motorsport background. I got involved in motor racing simply because of my own curiosity. But when the first time I came to Kyalami, I got to hear about Joubert Heights. And that turned out to be the control tower. And inside the control tower, I found a very steely-eyed Adrian Pheiffer looking at this young schoolboy over the desk and giving me the evil eye and telling me what to do or what not to do at Kyalami. But it was fantastic meeting them, both of you at the time. And it's an absolute pleasure to go to the circuit now and see something like the Adrian Pheiffer Lounge and that great new pit complex that's named after you. I think it's two very, very big compliments to two very, very special people. And yes, as much as I don't like the Bomas, I know they're worth a lot to Kyalami and survival. I feel they steal a bit of the favorite spots from the traditional days of going there with your car and parking next to the fence and having a braai. But at the end of the day, as you say, we've got to involve and keep the circuit going. And it's fantastic to think about the fact that this circuit is still the way it was. It's as old as I am. I was born in 61. So that's a huge compliment for Kyalami. And when you stand in that tower and you look towards Table Mountain, I can't think of another circuit that will have a more beautiful sight than that. Looking at Table Mountain and just absorbing the view is fantastic. You've got big shoes to fill, Dr. Mills, undoubtedly. But I think there's also a bright future for the circuit.
Yeah, I mean it's an incredible responsibility, you know, with in a world that we spend a lot of time talking about rights. You know, I want this, I deserve that, I'm entitled to this. You have to match that with responsibilities, and I have got a huge amount out of motorsport, probably more than I acknowledge. I mean, I think it's taught me a lot about perseverance. It's taught me a lot about logistics, management, organization, personal motivation. It's really taught me a lot about getting organized in life, as well as pushing yourself in terms of your own abilities. And so at a level of an individual, there's, I think, much to give back. But I think that Denis, as ever, undersells himself, and his generation, of course, is much better than later following ones at meeting responsibilities than enjoying rights. What I think his generation did for Kyalami was not only did they keep it going, which was huge because, it could have gone in the mid-1960s. Not only did they develop it, but they kept the ethos as a not-for-profit, what we call today a not-for-profit. So this institution runs, unlike most motor racing tracks, for the benefit of its membership and for the benefit of the general public as a facility that's on offer. Like everywhere, you have to pay a membership fee, but it's on offer to the general community to be able to enjoy motorsport. And I think that's absolutely outstanding in terms of where we are in the world, where most motor racing tracks are owned or managed by individuals or by companies and turned into profit centers. And we all talk about commercialization and profit centers. Kyalami is very old school, and it's run on the smell of an oil rag comparatively, because it's run in that fashion. And I think it's because we've inherited that ethos from people like Denis and Adrian and Cecil Barata and many others who've come before, that we continue in that tradition. We're not seeking to make money out of this. We're seeking to put money into the circuit and the facility for the next generations to enjoy just as we've enjoyed them. And I think that's the epitaph that they deserve, is they've kept it for the benefit of a majority of people at very little cost, and at no cost to the public, but at very little cost for even its membership, which is a remarkable story in the very commercial, money-centered, money-driven world that is motor racing, and particularly motor racing and everywhere today. So that's I think the legacy that they've left behind. Not just Kyalami exists, but it exists with a very unique ethos as a facility. And that's the responsibility that is enormous, actually, is to keep it going in that tradition. But I've learned a few lessons from these masters.
I don't know where you find the time, but you have authored some magnificent books on the subject of South African motorsport. And behind Clint is another book that came through the pen of Adrian Pheiffer. All of this, and I believe you can write another 40 books if you want to, because there's so much more available. Your books in particular, Dr. Mills, where are they available? Because I'm sure there's some of the listeners or some of the viewers here that after tonight would like to know more about Kyalami and the characters that built it.
Writing books is a trip down ego lane for the most part, because you're never going to get rich. Everyone thinks that you get rich out of writing books. It's actually to the contrary. You do it because of the passion and the catharsis. Absolutely. And the desire to write down memories. So there are of the 8 titles I've done in motorsport, there are only 2 still available for sale. The rest have sold out, and they were all written for the benefit of various charities, which gave it a even more special place for me. One of them is agriculture, furniture, and marmalade. Those are the words that Jackie Pretorius said to Jody Scheckter before he left for Europe. He pulled him aside and he said, those Englishmen, they after he'd won the Sunshine Series, those Englishmen, they're only impressed by big words, and this is a naive, relatively boykie from East London. He said, I'm going to give you 3, and you must use them all the time, and preferably in conjunction with one another, and that's agriculture, furniture, and marmalade. And I think that was probably Jackie Pretorius's personality down to a T. Extremely well-read, the ultimate rough diamond. And that's the title. That book is available at G&A Motorsport at Gunter Drotsky's. And you can also find it on the interweb. And then Saloon, Bars and Boykies, which is the most recent book that I did, which was really a big a coffee table size book. This one, because I had to go and reread. This is the proof that it's ring-bound. I had to go and reread it in preparation of this program to make sure I had my facts straight. That's also available at Gunter's. They're both limited editions of 1,000 copies. So I think they're nearing the end of their production line. But if you go around to Gunter Drodsky at GNA Motorsport, I'm sure he'll be delighted to sell you a copy. And I see myself as massively privileged to have spent time with more than 100 motorsport personalities, many of whom are no longer with us now, and really get to know them. And that, I think if I digress slightly, but this is about a motorsport story in many ways, I think the greatest undersold strength in modern society is not, how much we know. It's not about what degrees we have or what jobs we're in. It's about the relationships and networks that we build, because that's actually the thing that can change lives and change direction and change trajectories of institutions, of sports clubs, of all sorts of things. And I think that one of the huge things I've taken out of motorsport has been the relationships that I have got out of the sport, which brings me in contact with a completely diverse set of people that I would otherwise meet in my job. Most of my time is spent working with politicians and policy types and military people around the world, but this kind of brings me firmly back to earth, which I find incredibly refreshing. I think there's so much to be learned from older generations in terms of their stories, and I'm hugely privileged to being able to capture some of them, and those friendships endure. And people who were childhood superstars, untouchables in my eyes, the David Pipers, the John Loves, the Sam Tingles, people that I never thought I'd ever meet, I ended up becoming friends with, even Denis Joubert.
I couldn't agree more. I have to, if I may, I'm going to touch on something as well. The car behind me is a model of John Love's. I think it's Lotus 49, that. But Gunston became the first Formula One team to be in sponsorship, and I think that became one of the most classic color schemes ever in the sport. But the reason why I'm bringing that up now is, as you said now, in my day as a youngster, as I said, I had no background in motorsport. You used to go to the bioscopes often, and then you had these movie reels during the breaks or before the actual movie started, where they showed the Formula One races. And one race in particular caught my eye, and that's basically where my interest in motorsport got going, seriously going, and that was John Love stopping a race to assist his main opponent, John McNichol, in order to go for the South African Championship. And I thought that was the most sportsman gesture I've ever heard of in my life. Here's a man that could have taken the Formula One Championship by just cruising to the flag, stopping a race, and actually going to help fix his opponent's car before the race started. And, well, he went on to win the championship, but what a way to do it. And to this day, I thought John Love was, well, I didn't know him at the time. As you said now, later in my years, I had the privilege to meet him. And what a true gentleman, and what a great sportsman. And those are the characters that, in my opinion, build the sport.
Yeah, I mean, Denis, I'm sure would agree. I mean, these, if you you think of the I know which movie reel you're talking about. It was Terry Scott's Kyalami Productions. You'll remember this, Denis. And with Terry Scott with those big, thick Peter Sellers type glasses on, and I think Robin Emsey might have also had a hand in it. And they did those sweeps past the pits very dramatically when Kyalami never had a guardrail, of course, in those days. There was separation. There was, I think, just a piece of grass that demarcate the pits from the track. And that interview, of course, was done at Kyalami. And John McNichol's car was found to have a crack on it before the start. Excuse me. And they interviewed John Love, and he, as you quite rightly said, he held the race up. Unfortunately, McNichol had a big accident in that race, and Love did win his last of his 6 championships in a row. But it was a different era. But it doesn't mean that those acts of sportsmanship are past us at all. I think they're still here, and I think certainly at the type of level of motorsport that I engage with, it's very much about look, a competition is fierce. You don't want to lose, but it's also not it's not the defining feature in your life. It's all the elements thereof that define motorsport. So but I say that I don't think it's a better era or a worse era. I think we just live in a more commercial era, and in an era where perhaps the individual is less distinguishable because of the numbers of people that are inevitably involved in this. But I'm sure Denis and Clint have a view.
I think Denis is going off to bed.
Well, before he disappears, I have to touch on another subject, and that's, of course, the second and third generations of drivers coming through the ranks. Behind me, there's two reasons why that car is up there. One is Owen Ashley, who was a legend in his own right, and of course, that's a younger version of Denis Joubert driving there, who also became an international star in motorsport. Nou, I don't know whether he's hearing us.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Denis, hoor jy ons nog?
Ja, ek hoor julle.
Nou, ons skinder hier van jou.
Maar
Ek sê, ons skinder hier van jou. Ons sê, daar's 'n tweede generasie van die Jouberts hier agter my, en nog 'n naam wat daaraan gekoppel kan word is Owen Ashley in sy era.
Wat van hom?
The topic I'm trying to touch on is the impact that people like Owen Ashley had on local motorsport, and also, of course, the second generation in Denis Joubert taking your racing into his future.
Yeah, well, Owen Ashley had a huge impact on our racing in Cape Town. As you know, the cars that he built a long time back now are still racing, and we have a very successful V8 formula going, all due to Owen Ashley.
And the supercars are still going as well.
Yes, definitely.
Well, it's great to see all these things come together and create a future for Kyalami. We can only say thank you once again, Denis and Adrian. I couldn't put it better than Dr. Mills put it. It's awesome what you did for motorsport in South Africa, and in particular Kyalami. And we look forward to seeing Formula E come to Cape Town next year, even though it's not at Kyalami. As you said, it's going to involve Kyalami. The Rallycross is coming back. The 9-hour is going to become bigger than you can ever anticipate, Dr. Mills. I think that's going in the right direction. And please steer. I mustn't say this, but don't make it a GT3 formula. Make it an open formula where we can see some of the world's classics in both cars and drivers come back to South Africa.
No, I think the importance is to keep motorsport accessible. And I mean, I love the Krevetnik series of races in Europe, which I've participated in. They're hyper competitive. At the top end, you have GT2 cars, and it's an incredible formula. Excuse me. And at the bottom end, you have a kind of rung what you brung type thing. So it really allows that scope of fields, which made the Springbok series so special. You'd have a 917 and a Renault R8 or a Mini Cooper in the same race, and famously sometimes, particularly in the wet, the R8s used to gobble up the opposition. So we're trying to make it accessible, but also at a high enough level that we don't look like complete rednecks, and can attract international drivers of a stature, and that people really would be interested in seeing. So it's, as ever, it's a fine balance between accessibility, professionalism, keeping motorsport moving forward and keeping it slowly moving upwards, but not making it inaccessible for people. And that's my vision for Kyalami, is to try and make South Africa and particularly Cape Town and the city of Cape Town a premier international motorsport destination, not just for racing. As Denis has said, you can't run a racetrack just on races alone. You need to run a racetrack on volumes of activity. So bringing clients, bringing track days, bringing commercial activities to be able to, in a sense, fund motorsport and subsidize motorsport has been the Kyalami model, because that's essentially what we've done. We've kept motorsport accessible because we have a model of subsidization. The subsidization started 75 years ago. So it's amortized itself over a very long period of time. And as I said to you before, I mean, I think the real debt that we owe the likes of Denis Joubert and Adrian Pheiffer is that it's still run in the same tradition, which is in the modern era quite remarkable.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think we have crossed the 1 hour mark here. And Dr. Mills, I would love to invite you and your international guests coming out for the 9 hour to join us on this program somewhere in the near future again. And Denis, geniet die rustyd. Is wel verdiend.
Dankie.
Thank you, everybody. Right to everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
Doctor,
you.
and thank you, Mr. Joubert.
Thank you. Good night.